All right, we're live. Greetings, everyone listening to this right now, 6 p.m. in great old Turkey. And today's topic is going to be, I think, quite interesting. It's going to be pretty much on Christianity and politics, the historical stance of Christianity with regards to politics. I mean, how does Christianity manifest itself? Is Christianity, does it even care about politics? What about church and state? These are the things that I'm going to be talking about with my friend George. He is known as Orthodox Canonist on Twitter. His Twitter @ is in the description below if you want to give him a follow. How are you doing, George?
Good evening, everyone. Doing pretty well today. Excited to have this educational talk with David, and I'm here to learn as much as everybody else is. And of course, willing to add anything of interest, as I'm a big fan of this subject and I've read quite a few things on it. And yeah, hopefully it'll be interesting.
Yes, and by the way, if you could hear him live chat, make sure to let me know. Just want to confirm whether the sound control is fine. What I wanted to start with is kind of like my plan is to treat this subject in kind of two parts. The first part is going to be about the separation of church and state. What will be your reaction to it? Is it a good thing? Is it just a natural course of how things go? Or is there problems regarding the presuppositions of the separation of church and state? If there are problems, what are they? And the second part, the second stage, is going to be about, Christianity, its history in regards to, governments and how it kind of remains in governments, especially from the perspective of the Roman Empire, the Christian Roman Empire, the Orthodox, states historically like Serbia, Bulgaria, and also the Russian Empire. Those I will say are two, especially the Byzantine Empire, what people refer to as, I refer to as Christian Roman Empire personally, but what the Roman Empire and the Russian Empire I think are two great examples of how Christianity exists as the state religion. But first part is going to be about, well, is that a good thing? Should we even have it in the first place? And kind of just is also like, does it even matter? I mean, is this something dogmatic that like we have to believe? And if you don't, I kind of want to start with by saying that I think if this isn't on the level of dogma or anything like that, like the Trinity, right? It's not something that you have to confess in order to be an Orthodox Christian, in order to be baptized. Such topics, I think the general cliche, and I kind of want to start with just to get on the good side of many people here, is that Christianity and religion itself is not inherently political. It's not like a political ideology. It's a religious worldview, and so it's not something you can place on a political compass. So it's not like a political position or anything like that. It transcends politics, but at the same time, there are certain moral, rules that you have to follow that sometimes, political discussions get into. Like abortion is an example of this. You can't be consistently, you cannot be a Christian while supporting abortion. You just can't. It's impossible. You look at the canons of, Christian history. You look at scripture and how it states that life starts at conception and things like this. And, Christianity has a very clear stance on it. Whereas, most people who are pro-life, it's usually seen as a right-wing view, etc. So we also want to make that distinction very clear from the start so that we don't get people who just come up with these like strange arguments. Do you have anything to add? Something I might have forgot? Or do you want to just move on to... Yeah.
I think what David said is very important to understand. As we, of course, those new to Orthodox Christianity, probably not as aware as those of us who are baptized or perhaps undergoing catechesis, but Christ and his energies essentially infuse most human actions, especially when they're done piously and virtuously. And in this case, of course, when Orthodox Christians participate in politics, governance, anything that has to do with the law, for example, legislation, these things are inherently, at least we believe that God can act through us, and these things are obviously just like...
You cut off for a second there. But okay, I think he has... Oh,
these things...
Okay. Go on. Hello?
These things are infused by grace, of course. That was the point I was trying to make.
Yeah. I think that's a good point. It's kind of just this is gonna give you a sneak peek of like one of my main arguments. But one of the things I wanted to point out is one of the presuppositions of the separation of church and state, or I guess you can call it just separation of religion from government, is kind of man saying, look, we can govern ourselves. We don't need your rules. We don't need kind of like these, these religious things. We have no need for them. There's no place for them in governance. So we're going to do these things ourselves. And, whatever religious stuff you want to do, okay, you want to pray to God and whatever, okay, you can do that. But don't try to bring it into politics. But Christianity, I mean, is a religion that believes that it's part of all aspects of life. And so, when we talk about rulers, when we talk about governors, when we talk about the people who are the subjects who are ruled, the people of that nation, God is not going to say, well, I am within the life of these people, but okay, you guys can handle that part of your life. That's not really how it works. But to kind of get into the presuppositions behind church and state. So, you see the general argument behind it, right? So again, politics, the scripture shouldn't just be used as justification, or religion shouldn't get into, or the church shouldn't get into political decisions. Political decisions are about action. They're not about, we need to pray God this much. If you don't pray, then you're going to go to jail, which, the adherents of the unity between church and state don't believe that. But, you kind of see that mischaracterization. Religion ultimately doesn't matter. That's kind of the presupposition behind it, is that, religion kind of doesn't matter in governance. Religion doesn't really have a place when it comes to making laws, when it comes to making rules and such. But you start to realize then what ends up becoming the case is that the state becomes the church itself. And so what the state tried to avoid actually became the reality. And what I mean by that, when you look at the history of rulers, for example, the legislation and such, you see that many rulers, many lawmakers always justified their rules based on some divine principles and, metaphysics, not on, according to a council of 60-year-old white men in Geneva, this is what a government should always do. They didn't base their morality or reality or legislation on that. It was based off of principally due to divine principles and regulations, based off of divine laws. So I think Saint Justinian is a great example of this. He even today he has a massive influence in lawmaking. Saint Justinian pretty much based his laws, which European law is in some ways, has its source in Saint Justinian's Codex Justinianus. His law is based on the Old Testament, right? So that's where he finds his basis. You look at, Hammurabi. You look at all of these historical rulers. It's always about either, that person has a divine authority, or he is making use of God's divine authority, and that's the basis of laws, rules, morality, ethics. Today, it's just, well, let's have the Senate debate this and, come to an agreement, right? Suddenly, ethics stops being objective and becomes something that you can just decide by disputing between people by pure reason, pure rationality. So what has historically been the domain of religion has suddenly become the domain of the state. And so that's one of the examples that I wanted to kind of illustrate to show that, the separation of church and state isn't really as innocent as it seems. It has, in fact, several presuppositions behind it that fundamentally, especially for some religions, mean that these religions cannot exist to their fullness. For example, principally speaking, even in secular societies, some, religions are banned, right? So for example, if there's a cult of personality-based religion that suggests that, its followers should do illegal activities, right? Or support illegal activities in the state, then those religions are usually banned and considered to be, the enemy of society, etc. But principally speaking, there's nothing really preventing the state from banning, for example, Islam or Christianity or Judaism from their country by saying, well, this so and so religion doesn't really support this state decision that we make, therefore we should get rid of them. In fact, this is precisely what has happened in the 20th century, in communist Russia, in even in China, right? Many religions were kind of considered to be enemies of the state by their pure design, and so they were, the governments tried to destroy these religions. That's kind of what I wanted to add. Do you have anything else to add?
No, that's exactly right, David. And I think many people, especially those from America, take the First Amendment, for example, for granted, the freedom of religion. Now, historically, no countries had a First Amendment. And in fact, even in America, notice the First Amendment is, of course, being interpreted in such a way as that religious people, of course, are negatively affected, even though their religious freedoms aren't being taken away. But society is socially encroaching on their rights to practice that religion. The famous cases of, can the baker refuse to bake a cake for a same-sex married couple, right? For example, like really obvious examples. Religious folks such as us, Orthodox Christians, and of course even people from other denominations, are negatively impacted by society, say, turning away from God or apostatizing. The further society falls away from Christianity, the more the church and state separation becomes, I suppose, a reality. And
And
well, I think I think it's also worth considering. If we of course follow church tradition and of course the Old Testament, the New Testament, and as David said, the early Roman period, saints have never ever spoken out against the separation of church and state. Now, what does this mean exactly? Now, I think David mentioned how Saint Justinian codified Roman law, and in such a way that even, for example, I think, David, it's worth mentioning the sixth novella, right, of Justinian, where he mentions Symphonia.
Well, I didn't mention it, but you can talk about it. Yeah.
Well, Saint Justinian, who was the Roman emperor in the 530s AD, which is 200 years after the Roman Empire became Christian, Orthodox Christian in that sense. He instituted a series of laws, and one of those laws, in the preface to the law, he speaks about how the church and state are essentially two great gifts of God. And I'm paraphrasing it in summary. He speaks about how God gave mankind, two great gifts: priesthood, clergy, to look after the souls of men, and of course the empire, personified in the figure of the emperor or the king, who looks after the bodies of men and women, of course. And in this way, he of course states that the church and state, although are different, but if both of course follow the laws of God, there is a great interaction between the two of them. This is of course how Christianity understood itself from the beginning. This is how Christianity understood the interaction between church and state.
Yeah, and those who are tuning into the stream, this is the sixth novella of Saint Justinian. If you want, you can pause it and read it for yourself. But it's pretty much cited as one of the main sources regarding historical Christianity and how it saw religion and state together, how it saw itself historically in that regard. But before we kind of get into that as well, to kind of continue, I want to kind of continue with the problems of separation of church. Say, you gave an example of the caking, or even talking about, for example, these topics on YouTube can lead to issues, right?
That's right.
So what's supposed to be protecting religious freedom is exactly doing the opposite, and this is because I think, especially in the Western world, the manifestation and the realization of the government being the religious authority is taking place. As I said, what has historically been the role of religions has been usurped by governments, where governments suddenly become the arbiters of ethics and morality and reality and what is the objective reality of such things. And when a government, kind of separates itself from these kinds of questions, it pretty much starts to become concerned with only one thing, and that's power, right? Where religion isn't there, power becomes the only reality. And so governments start to base their worldviews on power alone. And this is exactly what happened in the 20th century. I mean, we had 2 world wars, many different governments, all of them happened to be atheistic, but all of them at the same time happened to be religious in the sense that the government became the deity, right? The government became the ordaining, the supreme power of the local god of that country, right? Where you want to talk about Italy, Germany, Russia, China, Japan, right? These different countries, even England, France, these countries have committed various different atrocities. They just don't talk about it as much. They only talk about one country's atrocity, and sometimes they talk about Russia's atrocities as well. But they don't talk about the atrocities committed by all of these different countries, right? Because they're not as popular. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that, the realization of an atheistic worldview in the governmental space has been realized historically. And it didn't work. It resulted in mass death. So a lot of people usually like to talk about, religion causes wars all the time, etc. If you actually research that, you will find out that, I don't know what the exact percentage of it is, but a really, really low percentage of wars, I think 2%, 3% of wars were due to religious reasons, right? Now everyone talks about the Crusades, etc., but half of the religious wars were started by, Muslim countries. So, most of the religious wars were due to Islam. And this is not kind of like a criticism of Islam or anything like that. It's just pointing out that even by that metric, I won't criticize Islam in that regard. I will criticize in a different regard is what I mean here. But even by that metric, you start to realize, actually religions don't really start wars. What really starts war is, intergovernmental politics between different nations, right? The reason why Europe was scared of the Ottoman Empire wasn't because the Ottoman Empire was Muslim. It's because the Ottoman Empire was expanding as an empire. It's just how the empire saw itself as, we're gonna be surviving by expanding, because that's the only way they could go. Because if they don't, then their surrounding countries will try to stop them, and that's pretty much how those wars usually work, right? And this is not just some weird, strange defense of the Ottoman Empire. It's just how empires usually end up surviving. I mean, if you look at the history of the Christian Roman Empire, I mean, it's been expansive, but you'll notice that their expansionism is really defensive, right? It's not because they just want to have more lands, but for example, Saint Justinian saw himself as reconquering Roman lands instead of taking away Roman lands. And this resulted in, for example, when they're taking their old lands back, they didn't treat the people as if they were a foreign people, right? They treated them as if they were Roman citizens. Usually that was the standard procedure. And if that wasn't the case, then something was going wrong. But to kind of get back from that topic, is what I want to highlight again is that in the 20th century, we had the deaths of bodies. And in the 21st century, the late 20th century, and the 21st century, we're having the death of souls now because of this. And what I mean by that is just the severe depression, the severe mental health crisis that a lot of people are having. In America, teenagers are shooting other teenagers. We have in Europe, people running to abusive substances, not
That's
even
right.
just alcohol, but 420, stuff like that, and even beyond that, that has become normal, and that forms of escape from reality has become normal, because even though economically speaking we're in a better situation, it seems like these people really don't like this situation that they're in. And this is because the normal worldview of the average European Western first worlder is that nihilism, there is no God, there's no meaning of reality, we're all just little things rolling in space, and there's tons of different planets on the earth, and that somehow means we're insignificant. I don't know how how this argument is supposed to be a good argument, but that's what these people say all the time, is that we're insignificant because we're a small planet in a grand galactic scheme and whatever. That's the prevailing worldview. It's just nothing matters, and the soul has been ignored, and yet we have psychology. I mean, the whole point of psychology is the study of the soul, but society says the soul doesn't exist, right? It doesn't have any existence. It's just a material brain state thing, right? That's the general worldview, and all of this really comes from saying again that religion has no space in X. If religion doesn't have space in one part of the world, pretty much, then why does it have a part in any other aspect of reality? That's kind of the hidden trap behind it, is that if you accept that religion shouldn't be in political discussions, and people shouldn't be asking questions about what the base of your morality is, etc., etc., then where do you stop, right? Where do you just stop saying, okay, let's calm down a little bit, what's going on around here? And again, everything I've said here, I don't want people to take this as to say we need to form a political party that's religious, dude. I'm not saying anything like that either. I'm just kind of making a more grand narrative explanation historically, and if there's going to be changes, then that's going to take a long time. It's not going to happen in 5 years, right? You're not going to make America a Tsarist monarchy in 5 years. That's just not going to happen. It will be cool, but that's just not going to happen, right? So that's kind of the perspective I have regarding a lot of these things.
Yes, of course, and I think it's very important. When folks think about the separation of church and state, they usually think top down. For example, they think, well, how will, for example, President Biden interact with, say, Archbishop Elpidophorus from the Greek Archdiocese of America? But in reality, separation of church and state affects, I suppose, its negative consequences begin as well from the ground up. For example, how does the local public school, does the local school teach religious classes? Does it teach orthodox morality, or does it promote, say, alternative values that we see today, so prominent on TikTok, for example, right? What kind of morality will your children be taught at the local school? Which will the local council, for example, provide? If your church petitions for land, right? Will the local council provide that? Will the local police force defend your church during, say, riots in a given city? For example, in the 2020 riots, which happened after a certain, event, will, for example, police forces show up to protect the church? Will the local, law enforcement defend, I suppose, your orthodox way of life? Of course, all of these things will eventually, I suppose, the separation of church and state is not just a Reaganistic trickle-down effect. It can affect the lives of Orthodox Christians from the bottom up, from very simple things.
Yeah, and that's an important point to keep in mind, is that whether you like it or not, and that's what some people don't realize, that I myself advocate kind of just like not caring about politics and what's happening in the world, but at the same time, you want to kind of have your boots on the ground and say, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to stop, whatever evil that you're trying to commit against us. And if you don't do that, then what's going to happen is that you're going to get trampled, right? That's usually what happens, is that, so you can't take a total pacifist stance or anything like that, because if you do that, you're basically forfeiting ground to your enemies, right? So that's another problem that Christians make, a mistake, that is basically saying, oh, well, let's just give up, these things. Let's just give up, political things, right? I don't talk about politics that much, because I think, I think a religious revival is a better way of helping people. But we also need to understand, if you don't show any presence, then the evil people that you hate so much, they're just going to say, okay, well, there's no opposition. Let's just keep on rolling, right? And that's that's another reason why the separation of church and state. I don't think a Christian, if he really believes that he wants to kind of, do good to society, it's not something you should support. And you mentioned Archbishop Elpidophorus. What's really interesting is that Patriarch Bartholomew, he has a book. It's in Turkish, but I think it's called Face to Face with the Mystery. or something like that. It's in, the book is in Turkish, maybe it's in Greek. I don't think it's in English. But I read this when I like a year, like 7 months after I became a catechumen. And one of the things that he constantly talks about is like how bad secularism is. So even Patriarch Bartholomew, for example, understands that secularism is a big problem, right? And he openly talks about this in this book. He doesn't now he doesn't take the like the monarchist trad stance, but he basically says secularism is a big problem because what it ends up becoming is it becomes depression, it becomes nihilism, it turns into self-abuse, it turns into hatred towards other men. That is not a good thing, right? That fundamentally goes against Christian principles. And so he feels that he needs to speak against it. And before I ask for your additional comments, if you have, George, I want to thank Flutter Basement for that $1 super chat, giving that think emoji. I should probably invite him on one day. He deserves it. But do you have anything else to add, or do you want to move on to the more juicy stuff with the?
Well, I think His Eminence Patriarch Bartholomew is completely correct in this, and I think we see this reflected in, again, future Saint Father Seraphim Rose's book Nihilism, where he talks about how society essentially, once it loses its religious grounding, it cannot find that grounding in secular laws. You cannot find an objective meaning to life in, say, the criminal code of your country, which doesn't mention God at all. Even the American Constitution, it does mention God, but what God does it speak about? Does it speak about the Trinity? It's just kind of like a vague theistic deity, right? It doesn't even specify, I suppose, in any way. It doesn't mention Christ by name. I think all these things lead to a great social depression, and of course, the moral social decline we see these days. And of course, this is followed up by tragedies such as, I think, shootings, riots, the recent, reactions to the pandemic, whichever position you take on that issue. All of these, I suppose, perversions of social life, they come out of the fact that we have, I suppose, as J. Dyer likes to say, we have taken this Western New Age modernistic idea that religion is something that should be done in private and not publicly. You cannot express your orthodoxy or your Christianity or, for example, your Islam, your Catholicism in public. It must be kept in the household, right? You cannot express it outside on the street. You cannot, for example, spread the message. It cannot influence society in any way. But, of course, the people pushing this idea, they themselves want religion to leave society, but they want to replace it with something else. And that something else is not a blank slate secularism. No. As we can see today, the people, for example, grooming children in public schools, etc., this new ideology that they're bringing about, it isn't a blank slate secularism. It is something else. It is spiritual in its own way, but of course it follows a different kind of spirit than we do. It isn't the Holy Spirit. It's a series of other spirits that they follow. And of course, I'm sure. I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind. Our society, we are directly affected by this false ideal, this false belief that has been, I suppose, brought on. I suppose we were indoctrinated into it, this idea that the church and state need to remain separated in order for society to be healthy. But the reality is none of our saints, none of our holy fathers, even Patriarch Bartholomew, who many view in a negative sense, unfortunately, even he himself cannot take this position because he, as an educated Greek bishop, he understands that the church has never, ever taught the separation of church and state to the same extent as society tries to force upon us. Just to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and we kind of had to also understand, well, what's the opposite of the separation of church and state, because there's kind of like a metaphysical understanding behind it too, right? With the kind of the current Western metaphysics, well, not but the prior one, because the current one is really the belief that metaphysics doesn't even exist, but is kind of just the idea of, and we talk about this all the time, I talk about it all the time, Jay Dyer talks about it all the time, is the idea of, distinction entailing separation. So if the church and state is not separated and they're united, doesn't that mean that they become the same thing? And that's kind of the view that the West took. And you can see the example of this with the papal state, right? I I think really when the Vatican started to go in a wrong decision was when the papal state started to be formed. Because prior to that, the papal, the Roman See was part of the Roman Imperium, and it was not a political entity, right? But it then started to become a political entity, and it still is to this day. And the reason why it is because, well, if the separation of church and state is not going to be real, it's not going to be real in this small little city, right? That's how it's going to work. And so in that scenario, you see a confusion between church and state, right? The church becomes the state becomes the church. And so Saint Justinian and the Roman emperors were, and of course the clergy of the Roman Empire were very careful in understanding that, yes, we're not, we're going to follow the model of the double-headed eagle. What's the symbolism behind the double-headed eagle? Well, it holds the sword, which represents authority, the power of the government, and it holds the orb, which represents the church. And it's one thing, right? It's the eagle holding both of these things, right? So that's the symbolism behind that the flag of the Roman Empire, of the double-headed eagle, not the Freemasonic double-headed eagle. That's a perversion of Christian symbolism, right? But so what's happening here is that the distinction is understood, and so church officials don't become state officials, and state officials don't become church officials. In fact, in the church itself, there are canons that straight up, very openly say that a clergy cannot be working for the government, right? Like he cannot be he can't be employed by the state. He can't be a governor. He can't be the ruler of that country. I think Apostolic Cannon 6, for example, says, "Let not a bishop, presbyter, or deacon undertake worldly business, otherwise let him be deposed." And worldly business here refers to, owning, being a governor, taking a government position, basically. So that distinction is still maintained, because if that distinction isn't maintained, then both the church and the state become dissolved and confused into this church-state entity, like it kind of is today. So that distinction is still preserved, but the roles are clearly defined. And so, for example, if you believe in a theocratic government, you don't necessarily, for example, have to believe that a clergy should be a government official, right? And that's, I think, like when I first heard that, my mind was blown. I was like, wait, what? I thought the whole point of theocracy was having clergy be the government officials, but that's actually not what the case is. And so that's a very important thing to note, so that people can understand what exactly has happened in history, not the confusion, but rather the protection of the roles of each. And having said that, if you don't have any other comments, I think we can talk about, before we move on, we can talk about the history of monarchy, I suppose, or empires. Do you have any other comments to add?
Yeah. No, I think it's essentially what David said, referring to the Apostolic Canon. So these are rules which the Church instituted very early on. So the Apostolic Canons is a series of canons which, by all accounts, have existed. At least we believe, if we trust Church tradition, we believe these canons were preserved by the Holy Spirit from the times of the Apostles. So since the Apostles' time, they have instructed us, and us all Christians, that clergy should not hold any positions, any worldly positions, which means, in our particular sense, government positions, as David said. So a priest cannot be a judge in a local court, for example, cannot be a magistrate. A priest cannot be a governor, a mayor, a president, a prime minister, etc. A priest cannot be a king and a priest at the same time. A bishop cannot be an emperor and a bishop simultaneously. All right, one and the same. And of course, the opposite side of the coin, of course, is in the church. Who can, for example, conduct sacraments, right? By the grace of God. Only ordained clergymen, bishops, priests, and of course, deacons assisting them, right? We don't see kings, we don't see governors, we don't see members of parliament conduct sacraments, even though they hold these said worldly positions. We already see the separation of power. This is outside of, for example, taxation, schooling, who controls the military, all of these questions aside. just this basic separation has been at the forefront of Christianity since the time of Christ and his apostles. This is very clear. The only place where these two things are united is, of course, the figure of Christ himself, the Son of God. Christ is both king and high priest at the same time. Everywhere else, the two roles are separated.
Exactly.
And I think this is important. This is why we sort of vehemently oppose the idea that of the papal states, right? Which I know a lot of trad caps on Twitter, they promote this idea of the papal monarch going out with his Renaissance army and conquering the nearby like Florentines or Venetians. But this idea that the Pope can lead an army is, in our sense, a huge perversion of reality and church tradition. Yes, it is sometimes justifiable to, for example, bring a bishop along on a military campaign, but the bishop himself should not lead the military. For that, he has princes, generals by his side doing all of that, getting their hands dirty in worldly business. The priest, the clergyman, must firstly be there to perform sacraments, right? So Christ, in only these two roles are only united in Christ. Everywhere else, unfortunately, because we are only human, we are all sinful, these things are separated since the time of the apostles. So even the apostles were not generals, mind you. They weren't Roman generals, they weren't leading armies. No, they were firstly spreading Christianity and committing the sacraments, right? Sorry for that tangent, David.
It's a great tangent. It reminds me of a historical instance where the Christian Roman Emperor massacred citizens in Thessalonica. I think this was Emperor Theodosius.
That's right,
and
the great.
He was excommunicated by Saint Ambrose of Milan because he was under the jurisdiction of Saint Ambrose. He was excommunicated by Saint Ambrose and had to endure penance for his actions. So a lot of people talk about, right now, apparently there's a Roman Catholic bishop that excommunicated Nancy Pelosi or like some Democrat politicians for being pro-choice, and people are getting mad about it. That's not his job. Actually, that's precisely what his job is, because what Emperor Theodosius did wasn't really just getting his hands dirty and just doing government things. Mm-hmm. It's really, him really violating his role as an emperor. And Saint Ambrose basically said, look, you have to, for your own good, you have to do penance. And the same thing is called on today right now. But non-Roman Catholics, people who aren't even Christian, are criticizing the bishop, the Roman Catholic bishop who made the decision. What the bishop's job, that's literally what the bishop's job is, right? Because she's promoting the murder of infants, and that's obviously not a Christian thing to do, right? That's the realm of Christianity. That's the realm of politics only. But if you believe in separation of church and state, then I suppose a government official can just murder someone in broad daylight and the church can't do anything about it because I guess separation of church and state, right? That's what that logic leads you to.
Right.
So we need to also understand that, and what you will then see is because one of the points that people are afraid about, authoritarian regimes is that, well, authoritarianism, they can just do whatever they want. But if these leaders actually do believe in God, which, the same question can be asked for like even people today. If these people believe in God, they will be afraid of some of the actions that they take. Well, those that don't really are much more likely to do heinous acts than those who don't. I'm not saying that religious people don't commit heinous acts, obviously. What I'm saying is that by comparison, non-religious people are much more likely to commit heinous acts. I mean, for example, communism is a great example of that, right? You can talk about the merits of the ideology or not, right? You can talk about Marxist theory and its merit, but you look at the reality, whether the system is actually politically good or not, it doesn't matter, because once you divorce religion from it, well, it became its own religion. It became a death cult, really, a literal death cult. The same goes for other things like fascism, etc. as well. Even though there's some Roman Catholics that will argue Mussolini is in heaven or whatever. Well, the point is still here that the government takes the role of the church in here. But historically, because of this distinction, you actually saw the church being a check towards authoritarian power. And one thing I want to note before you mention some additional things is, for example, when it comes to social justice, right? proper social justice was done by Christian bishops and clergy. That's something that a lot of people miss. But Saint John
Mhm.
Chrysostom, for example, was fighting for for those who were suffering from poverty, and he was fighting even the empress for that, right? For that cause, right? He was really fighting for, properly speaking, social justice. Saint Basil the Great similarly was fighting for social justice, promoting, the what was the term that people used again? Sharing your wealth, right? Redistributing wealth, basically. But the difference is that this redistribution wasn't due to compulsion, because what the law makes you a slave, but grace makes you free. And so this redistribution was due to grace, and that's obviously Christian virtue. Whereas, doing it by government, etc., that's what makes you a slave, right? And there's a huge difference between the two.
That's right. And are you truly redistributing your wealth via free will? Is it actually benefiting your conscience if you're doing it? If the government forces you to pay, for example, taxes, and those taxes are therefore redistributed. For example, like an income tax, and the government claims that 10% of your income tax is then redistributed to the poor people. Are you actually benefiting from that? Morally, instead, as opposed to giving money yourself to the poor out of your own pocket, tithing, for example, of the church, if the church forced you to pay, or, if you could do it out of your own free will. Of course, this is where I think some good libertarian points come up, but that's kind of neither here nor there. Essentially, I think what the point is he's trying to make is that these ideologies, they forgot all about God, and they put themselves in his place, and of course in the place of his laws. And communism, I think we see this obsession, this Marxist socialist obsession with helping people sort of rise up, and this like obsession of social justice, right, against social inequality. But it ignores the fact that these improvements in life aren't to the benefit of anybody's spiritual life. They're only benefiting, say, perhaps physically, right? Perhaps materially, they're benefiting us humans, but spiritually, they're not. If anything, they're deadening us, which is why we see most of these Marxist states, they turn into these cruel, sadistic places of these mechanistic, I suppose, constructions of death. I don't think that is coincidental. I think leaving God out of the picture and just forcing everyone to be, to be as selfless as possible is just not the Christian way. It doesn't lead to God, essentially. Which is, I think, David would agree that that's why all these projects of a Christian version of socialism over the years have failed. And of course, there was many attempts in the 20th century to try and sort of cohabitate the two. Even in Russia, of course, during the 20th century, the church tried to cooperate with the Soviet Union to try and somehow turn it towards orthodoxy, but it could never get there. Eventually, the entire Soviet system fell apart because based on its own contradictions, but it could never embrace orthodoxy because of its sort of foundations, just based on the fact that it forced people to do things, and the church essentially encourages people to do things out of their free will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another example I was going to give is kind of like the freeing of slaves by Christian bishops and clergy at those times. Which, by the way, we talk about freeing people, etc. I mean, wage slavery is a real thing, but what really happened is freedom in the spiritual sense and also in the physical sense at that time as well. And we also need to understand, freeing slaves at a time when such a belief wasn't really even contested, right? Much. Most people kind of understood, yeah, that's just a natural way things go. What's the big deal? But so what you see then with the church is that the church doesn't really try to make a political, say, because that's just not its responsibility. It's not responsible with the ideology or the governmental decisions. What it's responsible for is tending for the souls of its servants. So one of the things that, for example, people talk about, with relation to redistributing wealth, it's a great example, is people talk about, we need to do this policy, and those that don't listen, we're just gonna pew pew them and all this kind of stuff. The solution really is about, well, you got to give these people, I mean, this is going to sound a bit libertarian, but you can incentivize these people to actually do these things, and the incentivization isn't going to be done by like tax breaks or anything like that. I'm not saying in that sense. The incentivization is going to be a genuine spiritual reason, not a reason of, oh, well, I'm going to only think of myself, right? And that's kind of like the work presupposition of both libertarianism and even I would say of many, Marxist systems and many other ideological systems, is that it's usually people will always think what's best for themselves. So we're going to like manipulate them to like make them think what's best for themselves. But that's not really how people really operate. That's not respecting their freedoms, and that's not really a Christian thing to do, properly speaking. And so when we talk about, for example, the Sermon of the Mount, right? Sermon on the Mount, sorry. And the decrees that Christ gives, and you should give alms, you should love your enemy. These things are not to be done by, I mean, the whole point, when you see these like liberal secular people talk about, Republican Jesus will not do this. That's Republicans believe in Republican Jesus, but real Jesus is like, he believes in what I believe. No, he doesn't, because what you think real Jesus, so-called real Jesus, believes is just law-based slavery, right? But the whole point of the gospel is that we become free in spirit, right? We become free by grace. We don't get beholden by the law. And you want to institute these things which you think are good, which they might be good things, but you want to do them by force, by law. That's the opposite of what Christ was preaching. You're doing exactly the opposite of Christianity. And these people don't even realize that. And that to me is insanely comical. And what we want to do is that, and this is why I believe in kind of like a spiritual revival is much better than kind of just like basing things politically, even though people who focus on politics and world events do have their uses. That's why I think both are good. And before I let you have your speech, I'm going to be reading 2 super chats. $5 from Rachel Wilson. Thank you. She says, the U.S. is stuck in a false dialectic which presents liberty and tyranny as the only options. Luther's freedom of conscience is the basis for this. I will say that's pretty much, freedom is seen as like the ultimate good, regardless of what your religious worldview is. But freedom itself requires a justification in a religious manner.
Could I read the next super chat, David?
Yeah, sure.
So thank you for the $5, David. Sure, I greatly appreciate it. I think your comment is on the money. You are right. Of course, in the Byzantine Empire, starting with Constantine, and of course with even the Russian tsars and emperors, you do see the tsar and the emperor are blessed with certain privileges which, say, normal laity did not have. For example, Roman emperors and Russian tsars and emperors, if they were Orthodox, they were allowed to kiss the bishop on. So when we usually approach bishops, we of course bring our hands together for a blessing. When an Orthodox emperor met a bishop, they would clasp hands, sort of like a bro handshake, if you can imagine that. So when two bros shake hands, right, in a sort of like colloquial street fashion, and they would kiss each other's hands. For example, I'm not sure if you guys have ever seen two bishops greet each other. How do they greet? They kiss one another's hands at the same time. An emperor would do the same with a bishop or a metropolitan or a patriarch he would meet. And of course, as David mentioned in the super chat, of course, emperors and tsars were allowed to commune behind the altar. So as most laymen like ourselves, me and David, we take communion right at the altar gates. Emperors and kings were allowed to commune inside the altar. That is true. But again, David, of course, as we all understand, emperors and kings still were not fully in the rank of clergy because they could not perform the sacraments. So yes, they participated in communion in a special way, but they could not, for example, they could not perform the laying of hands sacrament, or they could not, chrismate.
Yeah.
So that they were limited, but they were granted these grace-filled privileges. And of course, these weren't just invented by us Orthodox Christians or Catholics or any denomination. No, these were passed down, and these traditions were blessed by the Holy Spirit. And I mean, the evidence is there. None of our saints ever contradicted or counter-signaled these traditions. So,
Yeah.
amazing super chat. Thank you for pointing that out, David. And I'll
Yeah.
let David answer the next super chat.
The
There's one
other,
more.
yeah, yeah. David should thank you for the $10 in total. The priest and king are not entirely distinct, and this is why I say that they're not separate. They're distinct. They have distinct roles, but they're not separate. So I will say, for example, the monarchical institution and the kind of privileges that the emperor had in the Roman Empire was, first of all, that was recognized and given by the church itself. It's not a power that the emperor just decided to, I'm going to have this responsibility on myself. That's not really how it was seen, right? And we also need to look at, for example, the 7 ecumenical councils. This is a point I make all the time against Roman Catholics, because in Roman Catholicism, after the 8th ecumenical council, and I'm talking to the Rome, according to the Roman Catholic Church, the 8th ecumenical council was the Council of Constantinople in 869, which is referred to as the Ignatian Synod. And the Orthodox 8th ecumenical council is the Council of Constantinople in 879, which annulled the Ignatian Synod and is referred to as the Photian Synod. And this synod also rejected the Filioque. But what I point out with these councils is that really the 8 councils, the 8th, we can talk about 7 ecumenical councils, they're all called by the emperor, right? So apparently and clearly the emperor had the power to call these ecumenical councils, but the proceedings of the council, well, that wasn't dominated by the emperor, you see. So if you look at the first ecumenical council, the most Saint Constantine could do is kind of just make suggestions. So for example, the consubstantiality clause, that was a suggestion by Saint Constantine, but that suggestion won't pass if the bishops didn't decide to. And you can say, oh, well, that suggestion is actually him using soft power. That's not actually true, because if you look at the way that the council operated, Saint Constantine made it entirely clear that the bishops are the ones that's going to solve the issue of Arianism. He said, for him, it was just, he's just spectating, right? And it's his responsibility to kind of see how the proceedings were going and such. This is why, for instance, when Saint Nicholas slapped Arius, Saint Constantine sent him to the dungeon, because what he did was not proper, and he used this, his responsibility to keep the, obviously violence shouldn't happen in an ecumenical council, right? So he sent him to the dungeon, but during the dungeon, the Virgin Mary appeared, Christ appeared to Saint Nicholas and said basically, why are you suffering on account of me, right? And so he was, he left the dungeon with, his clothing was stripped away from him, but like they came back and saw him with the bishop gear, and he was brought back to the council afterwards, something like that, right? So
that's right. The Theotokos herself gave Saint Nicholas his vestments back in the prison. So when the prison's guard checked on him, suddenly Saint Nicholas was dressed in his bishop vestments, and it was like, okay, obviously there's a miracle at hand. Of course, they reported it to St. Constantine. He got St. Nicholas back, and of course, at the next, seating of the council, St. Nicholas was back in his spot. But this goes to show that, St. Constantine, obviously, he probably loved St. Nicholas, and he was great friends with him, but he still needed to follow the law. And the law states, like, if you assault somebody, you needed to be reprimanded, and so forth and so on. But that's a great example of where St. Constantine did not interfere in how the council went, but at the same time, he was its, I suppose, overseer, and he could ask questions and clarify things from the bishop.
Yeah, and so ecumenical councils, all of the ecumenical councils was done on the authority of the emperor. This is one of the reasons why the Lateran Synod of 649, it called itself an ecumenical council, but it wasn't. Why? Because it wasn't done with the ecumenic, that is the imperium, right? So it wasn't done with an imperial recognition. The theology of the Lateran Synod is definitely orthodox, but really what solved the issue of monothelitism was the Sixth Ecumenical Council in 680 and 681. That's when it was solved, and that was, properly speaking, an ecumenical council, whereas now the Roman Catholic Church thinks that it can make ecumenical councils, right? But the empire is not here anymore, right? The empire is gone. How are you going to make ecumenical councils? And I suppose the cope is that, oh, well, we're the empire now, right? But even historically speaking, that's not really true, because you had the Holy Roman Empire and all of these different events that happened, and that's kind of getting too much into different kind of history. But to kind of remain on point, just because we speak of the emperor as distinct, the ruler as being distinct, if he recognized the state church, the state religion, and he was a member of that church, well, he is a member of that church with an authority, right? With the authority of the emperor. And so this is one of the aspects of the unity between church and state, right? And this is, for example, this doesn't really exist today as much, right? Even in Russia with Putin, it's a lot more, Putin doesn't have those kinds of privileges, right? For example. So by Orthodox standards, we won't really say he's of that stature, right? When's the last time Putin called the Council of Bishops? Maybe he did. To my memory, never, right? Because the state of Russia today doesn't really allow for that kind of things to happen, because I think Russia is still in need of some kind of healing. But to kind of switch gears from Russia back to the Roman Empire, I suppose I don't actually have anything else to add. Do you have anything to point out? Because if not, we can talk about kind of like what the saints say about the church and state, right?
Well, I think there are also some, we spoke about some of the privileges that the emperor had, and, there are great examples of excesses where, for example, the emperor took upon himself. And when we say emperor, minor kings and princes also did the same, but the emperor, I suppose, as the highest figure as the highest form of Orthodox layman, right? As the highest sort of office that an Orthodox layman could reach, right? If God selected you for that role, it would, there were some pretty, I suppose, exuberant excesses that they would reach. I think the best example of these excesses would be when, during the iconoclastic period, right? The emperor decreed that icon worship was inappropriate. And this lasted for a good 80 to 100 years, on and off, of course. And mainly the emperor influenced, of course, he was under the influence of local bishops who also believed icon worship was bad in the 700s and 800s AD. That was a huge travesty, and it dealt an enormous blow in the Byzantine mindset on church and state relations. For a long time, Orthodox bishops, including saints, did not trust, I suppose, Roman emperors with, I suppose, giving them that authority back. But eventually, of course, things returned to their normal sort of God-given order. But there are these excesses happen not just in Roman history, happened in, of course, Catholic history, when the Pope, so I suppose, took on too many prerogatives on himself and did not want to share that power with a local prince or king. It happens. It goes either way. There are all these, I suppose, examples where it just, of where the balance, essentially, the balance between church and state in who performs which duties is shifted, and I guess imbalance and chaos is created.
Yeah, I just remembered, before we move on to kind of what the saints say about church, and this is kind of like your expertise is on Twitter. You post a lot about what the saints say regarding Russia, what the saints say regarding the government and such things. Before we move on to that, though, I want to talk about a little bit about a scriptural objection some people use against monarchy and such things, and kind of make the argument that, oh, actually Bible doesn't really comment on this much. Actually, Bible is closer to separation of church and state and such. And it's about from the Old Testament, when Israel was ruled by judges. They asked for a king like the other nations, and it was not seen as fit to God's eyes, but he still allowed it to happen. And Israel was in a much worse situation than before because of that. And some people use that to argue, therefore, then monarchy is actually not the ideal governance and such. I will say, the first thing I will say is, well, you need to understand, first of all, when we talk about scripture, you need to first look at it from a spiritual standpoint, right? So what's the spirit behind this request? Is the spirit behind this request saying that, God, we can move on to a kingly, rulership according to your, commandments, etc. Well, the word, we want a king like the other nations is key here, right? Because what Israel wanted, the problem with what Israel wanted wasn't a monarchy. That's not the problem. The problem was they wanted a monarchy. They wanted a nation like the other nations. And what were the other nations? The other nations were pagan. The other nations didn't worship the God of Israel. The other nations actually represented the separation of church and state of today more so than what Christian history is about in the past, right? So Israel wanted a secular society. They wanted a secular government. And from me, that's, I think, the main problem, and not the problem of wanting a king, right? And that's why there were issues because of that. Not because, the system of judges is the superior. For that time, that's what God instituted, and that's what they should listen to. But they said, we know better than you. We want a government like other nations have. And in fact, that attitude is really no different than what a lot of Christians, unfortunately have, which is we want a government like other nations, we want a secular government, right? That's pretty much what, is popular today. And so that's kind of like the main thing I will respond to that with.
Yep, of course, and that same utilitarian pragmatic spirit is what forced the last generation of Israelites, right, to choose Barabbas over Christ, right? We want Barabbas, we don't want Christ. Same as they didn't want the prophet Samuel, they wanted their own king, and of course God gave them a king. He gave them Saul, and Saul turned out to be an imperfect ruler, right? Eventually he started off well, eventually he was imperfect, but instead of going back to the judge system, which was very unique for its time, what did God do? He told Prophet Samuel to elect David and to anoint him in secret. So notice that. So God himself sort of goes back and just anoints a proper king in secret who later rises up and rules Israel. And of course is Christ's ancestor, the blessed King David. Also noteworthy. So if God really did not plan monarchy for the Israeli people and for the future, I suppose, Christian nations, then why did he, if this is how a liberal or a Protestant would push the issue against monarchy, why would God then anoint King David? Why wouldn't, say, Prophet Samuel just simply take back power? All these things are to consider. I think that using the Book of Judges against monarchy is, I think, a great travesty. And of course, it ignores the other great citation from the prophecy of Jacob to his sons, right? Genesis 49:10. So chapter 49, Genesis, where Jacob says to his son Judah, he says, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be given the obedience of the people." So essentially, we have Jacob prophesizing to his son Judah, who later, of course, from whose tribe comes King David and Christ himself, that the scepter of kingship will not leave your line. And when it does, Christ the Messiah will arrive. So the scepter of kingship, so monarchy, is predicted before Moses, even prior to the Egyptian slavery period, by Jacob himself, the grandson of Abraham. So monarchy goes that far back. God prophesizes monarchy, in the book of Genesis itself. You can go back and read chapter 49. Of course, read it. Check the Orthodox Study Bible. Check the commentary for it. I don't want you. You don't have to take my word for it.
Yeah, and David should thank you for the $10 super chat. He points out Israel wasn't ready for a monarchy because they needed to wait 10 generations from Judah to David. But God promised a monarchy from the beginning. Israel just was too eager, wanting Saul. I will definitely agree with those points. And even, you look at the system of judges, that's still a theocratic government, right? So, okay, monarchy is not good. Still a theocratic government is wanted. That still doesn't really prove the argument of the liberal here, does it now? It doesn't. And we need to also understand that just because the Old Testament is, we we have Christ in the New Testament and that the law is fulfilled in Christ doesn't mean that the Old Testament is completely ignored and we just say, oh, we don't care about it now. No, the Old Testament is still a great model for Christian societies. And people are going to say, oh, well, what about, this moral law that we don't use anymore? Well, those laws were again fulfilled in Christ, and like circumcision, right? Technically, we do have circumcision. It's called baptism. That's what circumcision is. So we don't do circumcision physically, we circumcise the spirit by baptism, right? That's what fulfillment means. It doesn't mean ignoring the old law. It means that participating in its fulfillment, and that is in Christ, right? And one of the things Christ didn't abolish, but instead used for himself, is kingship. And St. John Cronstadt has a statement regarding this where he says, hell is a democracy, but heaven is a kingdom. We regularly call heaven a kingdom, the kingdom of heaven. And there's a reason behind why it's called that. And so we understand then that earthly government, the ideal government then, should be based off of the heavenly kingdom. Obviously, it can't be reflected one-to-one because you can't create heaven on earth literally, right? That's impossible. That's the folly of the Tower of Babel. You can't have that. But you can model yourself after that. And this is the main problem with people who criticize, oh, that's too utopian. Well, utopianism is indeed bad if you take it to the extreme, but the whole point of utopia is to model the ideal and then working towards that, right? That's kind of like the point, like you kind of already accept that it's not going to happen, but we might as well try. Even the close attempt to this ideal government is still better than whatever else, right? And this is why I will say, the whole point of there are bad kings in history. They're bad kings in history. Oh, that's crazy. They're like, we are human beings. That's supposed to happen, right? That's a normal thing. But one thing people forget is that the best rulers also happen to be kings. When's the last time you had a democratic leader that shaped history? I can't think of a single person. Even Atatürk, he established democracy, but he didn't democratically take power in that sense, He was kind of like, he led a resistance against the Ottoman government, and he led a resistance against invading forces. That's not democratic at all. And even people who are, pro him admit that. Or what about, we can talk about it again, different rulers, they all happen to be kings. And I think that's actually a good argument, because it shows to you then the priority of democracy is not to have a good king or a good example for all of us to follow. It's just kind of the current reluctancy where we're just like, oh, let's just have this guy and then just sit back and relax. That's kind of how most countries are right now. And yeah, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, just wanted to say, of course, the modern state of things is far from ideal, and Jack O'Leary mentions in the chat Archbishop Macarius of Cyprus. That's a great example. Of course, so we were talking about how. So Jack, of course, is mentioning there are some outstanding cases. By outstanding, I mean outside of the norm, outside of the regular. There are cases when certain priests and usually bishops take up worldly roles, right? So we spoke about the canons, the apostolic canons earlier, and how the normative tradition of the church, as passed down from the apostles, is that bishops and clergymen should leave worldly duties, such as being judges, police officers, executioners, leaders, generals. They should leave that to the actual laity, right? Laity who are also members of the church, of course. If the laity just happen to be Orthodox, then I suppose then they're Orthodox, they're members of the church. But they should leave those duties to laymen. Now, of course, history being as it is, there were exceptions. Sometimes they were accidental, sometimes extraordinary. One of those, of course, is the Archbishop Macarius of Cyprus. So the Cyprus has its own little Orthodox church, which I believe it became independent in the 400s AD, so quite early. The Cypriot Orthodox people elected their own archbishop to become president in the 1970s. Very unusual, and of course this goes, against church rules, but I'm not here to judge the archbishop or what happened in the 1970s, but this did occur, okay? And yes, it happened in a time of strife between, say, the Greeks of Cyprus and the Turks, and there was some unusual unrest in that case. The other great example is in Romania in the 1930s, prior to World War II. The king of Romania elected the patriarch of Romania. His name was Miron. He elected him as the prime minister. So the patriarch and the prime minister was one guy for about a 10-year period. Very unusual, and you can say that's improper and this and that, but yes, we understand it's unusual. We don't use that as the norm. And of course, we never see I guess the most extreme case we never see throughout history. At least no pious Orthodox king or emperor or prince has ever performed sacraments in the church, right? We don't see emperors, for example, consecrating the Eucharist or anything of that sort. That's just a little bit outlandish. That doesn't occur. Well, of course, you can bring up some, of course, heretical rulers that have existed, but we don't consider them as Orthodox, even if they pretended to be. So yes, a great comment, Jack. I think that's straight on the money. Of course, the modern world, being as corrupted as it is, especially the 20th century, it's mostly in the 20th century where you will find these bizarre examples, especially with these countries LARPing as democracies, where it's like, oh, well, I suppose the people could elect somebody. Well, how about we just elect our local priest to be the mayor of the town? That sounds good. We all love him. We give him our confessions. He communes us. He baptizes our children. He performs, funerary rites. How about he can rule over us? Easy, right? We trust him. Well, now that particular priest has to, for example, command the local police force and perform all these, like, essentially get his hands dirty in the local bureaucracy. God did not intend this to be the norm, right? Yes, it has happened in history, but these are simply I suppose accidents. We are only human. Priests, clergymen, kings, emperors, remember, we're all human. We all susceptible to sin and mistakes. Sorry, go on, David.
Yeah. Like there's obviously the concept of economia. Sometimes the letter of the law is not followed in order to follow the spirit of it. If it does follow the spirit, then it's better than not doing so. But I think there's many examples from Serbian history too. I would say those are again exceptions. The norm is the canonical historical norm is the distinction and difference between the two positions. So once you kind of understand that, the kind of concept of economy, it becomes a lot more simpler to kind of understand any of the canons that, it's better for a priest to do that than like no one competent, right? It's the same reason why, for example, Saint Tamar of Georgia. I mean, Georgians refer to her as king, not even queen, but they refer to her as King Tamar because a king is by nature a patriarchal office, but she was still a saintly ruler, a great ruler of Georgia, and she's referred she is like, no one's going to criticize her. No Georgian's going to say, if you're going to criticize, but Georgian still then afterwards said, well, yeah, but we're not going to suddenly have a bunch of female rulers just because she was a good ruler, right? Because that's outside of the norm, but nevertheless it worked out perfectly. So we kind of have to understand, right? So the spirit of, rulership was fulfilled in Saint Tamar, King of Georgia. You can also call her Queen if you want to. I just like to say King because that's like the nature of the office itself. It's the same thing with Queen Irene, who's also a saint. Her office was also occasionally referred to as King, right? Emperor. Because again, there's kind of like, just like there's a nature and person distinction in the Trinity, right? We talk about three persons and one essence, and so the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are one God. Well, similarly in offices, whether religious offices or political offices, there's also that distinction too, right? So this is why, for instance, we can follow, there are bad bishops and bad clergy, etc., but they still possess that office. They still have that power. They still by nature are priests, deacons, bishops. And so God's grace is flowing through them, but that doesn't mean that they have to be good people, right? So you can kind of make that distinction. It's the same thing with rulers. A woman can, in an extreme circumstance, be the emperor in Georgia, but not emperor, but king, right? King of Georgia, for example. But the office itself is still distinct from who owns the office or who's taking place, and that's, I think, an important distinction to
Well,
make. Makes it easier to understand.
yeah, and I think another quite extraordinary account of this would be, so essentially after the fall of Byzantium, this role of, I suppose, Orthodox Imperium moved to Russia at the time, and of course Russia during the 1700s was ruled by mostly women for various circumstances, but it was usually mostly women ruled. And around, I think, the 1740s, the ruler of Russia was a certain Elizabeth I. Now she was quite successful in worldly matters, but during her coronation, and as you mostly some of you may know, but some of you may not, during the Orthodox coronation ceremony, when an emperor is made emperor, they are anointed with holy oil, they're blessed, and afterwards they're led in. The metropolitan or the patriarch of the particular city leads them into the altar for them to have communion at the altar table, right? So just as a priest would. And what did the Russians do in this circumstance? I mean, the emperor they anointed just happened to be a woman at the time. So the Metropolitan of Moscow led Elizabeth by the hand into the altar and communed her at the altar. And this happened, I believe, a couple times after that, including Catherine I, Catherine II, and of course it stopped there because there were no more Russian female rulers anointed to rule after the 1700s. But I believe in Byzantium the same thing happened. At least we don't have many, unfortunately, because of the loss of, I suppose, we don't have many documents out of Byzantium, but this did happen in Russia at least 3 times. So the empress was allowed to enter the altar once, just after the coronation ceremony. She was allowed to have communion at the altar that one time. It was quite special, but at the same time, we don't see any saints saying, okay, this is like a perversion. No, everyone understood this as, this is a one-time special occasion, and it's a blessed thing. Again, quite rare, similar to the Princess Tamar example, where Georgians are a very sort of patriarchal tribe of people, but they were ruled by a queen who essentially made their kingdom incredibly strong and powerful, and they obeyed that queen for a long time, and she's a great saint of their church. So, just some things to consider.
Yeah, and I suppose we can kind of move on to your expertise a little bit, which is about kind of like, what about Russia, right? What about the Russian Empire? What do saints say about the Russian Empire in the past and how they kind of see it today? Because this is kind of relevant with current world events. Now, you're Russian, so you're going to have pro-Russian bias. I'm not Russian, so obviously, whether you have the pro-Russian bias or not, I don't really care too much. So you can, so because it's just your country. But what usually I hear is that usually a lot of people constantly criticize like the Russia booism. Like, oh, if you speak positively about Russia because abortion is so bad there's so much degeneracy, and there is, right? That like there is that obvious problem. It is a very imperfect civilization at currently. I mean, right now, for example, I used to, for example, play Counter-Strike, and I used to follow the competitive scene. And I found out recently that one of the pro players who asked to marry his girlfriend, who was like an escort e-girl, OnlyFans type of a woman, right? 7 months after their marriage, she just leaks a lot of stuff, like him doing substances, like pictures of him, and it's like this is kind of like the society that they're in today, right? Like there needs to be a lot of fixing, etc. But I suppose what I'm trying to say is, well, the way to fix it is by, again, a religious revival of Russia. That's what's really needed. Absolutely. Instead of e-girl video gameism or whatever, right? Like that's the
100%.
That's what we need. But what do, for instance, saints say regarding kind of like the relations between church and state in Russia and such things? Like, you want to get into that?
Well, I think Russia's in a very peculiar state at the moment. So well, no pun intended, the Russian state is in a bit of a conundrum. Now, Russia has always had very close state relations from the time it was baptized by Saint Vladimir and Olga, as you guys probably know, in 988. That's the historical year where we consider Russia became Orthodox Christian, 988 AD. Now, since that time, the church has held incredible influence and sway over the Russian lifestyle. And of course, you can say Ukrainian lifestyle as well, because Ukraine and Russia were one back then, right? We weren't disunited like we are today, and Belarus is included in that. All the Russian princes listened very closely to their bishops. The best example, of course, in 988, as soon as Prince Vladimir got baptized, the first thing he did, of course, was he banned the death penalty. He simply said, okay, we won't have the death penalty anymore because I'm an Orthodox Christian. Why do I want the blood of, say, criminals on my hands? Like, I don't want that. He just said, oh, well, we're not going to have the death penalty anymore. And so he banned the death penalty. And the Council of Bishops, and there were some Russian bishops, mostly Greeks, that said, no, listen, Prince Vladimir, we're going to need the death penalty, at least as a deterrent. It needs to exist. So he had to bring the death penalty back. Capital punishment, right? This seems ridiculous, right? But we had literal saints and bishops tell the prince, force him to bring the death penalty back to Russia in the early 1000s, right? And of course, we see the same thing in public school education. The church essentially forced the Russian state to pay for public education and have priests involved. Priests were employed, of course, as teachers part-time to help out in schools. In Russia, and I believe in the Roman Empire as well, taxpayer money would pay for public schooling, and the public school system was run in part by clergymen. Clergymen would control the curricula. Of course, today we see what is the main issue in society. What is, I suppose, affecting us, just basic Orthodox Christians the most? I suppose where we send our children for an education, right? We watch these like libs of TikTok clips on Twitter, and we see these groomers and all these very interesting, colorful people, shall we say, just educating our kids in the most, I mean, not educating, but attempting to subvert our children to these malign ideologies. This wasn't a thing in Byzantium. I'm sure it occurred, there were abuses and such, but it didn't occur in the Roman Empire, and it certainly did not occur in Russia, because the priests and the church held very strong sway over the education system. And of course, the education system is part of the church and state discussion. I think David mentioned it. I mean, who pays for education? The state does, out of its taxes, right? And then the priests force themselves, essentially they say, look, the ruler literally comes to the priest for confession and communion. And at confession, the priest says, okay, look, buddy, we're going to need to fix the school curriculum. It's a little bit too atheistic. I really don't like these gender studies classes, for example. And the ruler simply crosses that out, and the subject is removed from the school. It was that simple. It was that black and white back then. And this was the case in Russia all the way up until 1917, until Saint Nicholas II was unlawfully deposed, and of course the Russian Revolution, essentially. So 900 years of priests and rulers from the local level all the way up to the emperor himself cooperated tightly on education. And this is essentially, I think, at the core of state and church relations. It's what do we teach the kids here? Do we teach them what some Freud guy wrote, or do we teach them what the saints have taught us, right? And of course, this doesn't affect subjects such as science and mathematics, etc., but still, curricula was heavily filtered and put through the Orthodox prism. Everything was infused. People tried to infuse the Orthodox lifestyle into infused God's grace into everything they did back then. And I guess this is where the Russian Church, you can see its influence on Russian society is ever increasing with every decade since 1991. It's 30 years now since the fall of the Soviet Union, and the Russian Church is gaining more and more influence in post-Soviet Russia. And this is a great thing. Essentially, Russia is returning to its roots. Ever since 988 AD, the Russian Church has held sway in Russian society, and I don't see this as a negative. Of course, as an Orthodox Christian, I see this as a great boon and as a great positive note. Russia essentially is just returning to its tradition. It isn't, encroaching on what once belonged to the secular people. No, Russia's simply returning And yeah, it may take a few more decades, of course, before, say, Russia gets a Tsar or an emperor. Putin, of course, is an Orthodox Christian himself, we're told. He goes to confession and communion. We're not sure to whom. It's frankly, it's none of our business. Like, David, do you want to add anything before we go a bit off
Yeah,
topic
yeah,
here?
yeah, yeah. In terms of education, I can add that in the Roman. So we need to first understand that the Russian Empire saw itself as the successor of the Christian Roman Empire. Whether that means Moscow is a third Rome or not is a different discussion. Even if it isn't, it doesn't really matter because the Russian Empire saw itself as that. It continued,
Mhm.
the moral, legal institutions. It continued the educational institutions. So one of the examples is that in the Christian Roman Empire, education was funded by the state. So even theoretically speaking, even someone middle class in the Roman Empire could be educated. Even women could be educated. It's just that really it was a choice not between like whether you can be educated or not. It's that whether being educated actually would help you in your situation or not. Kind of like that's why in the Roman Empire the literacy rate was 30%. So this means that at least one person in each household knew how to read and write. That's actually super significant. And like when you think about your own family, well, think about your own family. Your mother, your dad, they probably don't read and write. What do? They go on social media. You go on social media. You watch the television, like just a complete mind bender. So, like, really, each household was actually much more educated back then than they are today because compared to back then, they were actually learning about things that matter. Whereas today, you learn about, oh, in Rumplebottom Galaxy, there's a black hole. Wow, I really care about that. Thank you for letting me know about that. Or in Africa, there's a tribe that does poop smearing. Why will I need to know about that? That's idiotic, right? But instead, you learned about scripture, you learned about your own country, you learned about grammars, the origin of some of the terms that you have. You learn about a little bit about kind of like philosophical thinking, and you learn about your own craft, right? So someone who doesn't know how to read and write probably knows how to cut wood really well, and he teaches it to his child or teaches it to other people. That's kind of how education was done back then, kind of how education was done in Russian, really many European societies in general. That's one point that I will add in terms of education is that ancient education is way more superior than from a principle standpoint than today. The only reason the literacy rate is so high today is because of technology, right? The opportunity cost is like not there anymore. The opportunity, the chances of you having to learn in the system is based on you have to learn how to read and write, right? Like that's what it's based on. But do
Mhm.
you even use it in a useful manner? Not really. Like most people don't. Um, so that's one thing that I will also point out in regards to the topic of church and state. I'd like to add perhaps uh, how things were a lot more localized too, right? One thing that we have right now is the kind of view that people have is well, monarchy, it's authoritarian, right? It's centralized, it's this and that. Not necessarily. My personal opinion is that centralization is due to technology, not due to political ideology. So it's easier to kind of have influence over what other people do as the government if you have good technology compared to, you know, the medieval era, for example, right? So even if you're authoritarian at that time, really, what are you gonna do, right? Can you, for example, if you're the emperor of, the Byzantine Empire, are you gonna like say, hey, this one guy in Trebizond, I want his head cut off? Like you're probably not gonna be able to do that. Whereas today, oh, this guy has a YouTube channel. I don't like him. Let's send Secret Service to him. Let's like have him banned from YouTube. Let's like silence this guy. Well, you can do that now in a democratic society. And you don't even do it through the government, you do it through mega corporations, right? So really freedom is not about, freedom is kind of like a mathematical equation of how much power the state wants to use and how much they can actually use, right? It's that kind of an equation. So I think that's a very important detail to bear in mind as we kind of move on to this discussion. That's the only point that I will want to add.
No, 100%. There's this myth of, freedom essentially being the greatest good, the greatest thing that humans need to achieve individually as well as collectively. And they never ask the question freedom to do, to force something. They always kind of propose it as freedom from monarchy, freedom from, laws, freedom from oppression, etc., etc. And eventually, of course, in today's world, we're getting to the stage where, we're, I suppose, people who have a more liberal outlook on life are pro- saying that, well, we need freedom from, freedom from really basic things, biology, for example, freedom from, mental institutions, freedom from gender, etc., etc. So freedom from any sort of category binding us down, like sort of grounding us in reality itself. So first, as we see this in Western Europe, right? The Western Europeans unfortunately freed themselves from monarchy first through a series of revolutions. Then they freed themselves from the church via, through Protestantism, or maybe it went in the other order. Not doesn't really matter. Depends on the country. Then, of course, they freed themselves from, you know, other social institutions. Like the laws were changed, the laws became more free, and eventually now we see freedom is like the ultimate idol which everybody follows. Right? It's uh, it's really quite damaging. And church and state relations, how does that, how does freedom sort of interact with church and state relations? Well, the truth is, you aren't actually free. As David did mention, slavery still exists to this day. Of course, there is wage slavery. There's a slavery to everyday obligations. Are you actually free? Oh, are you free from paying taxes? No, you're not. Are you free from the law? No, you are not. You are bound to the state. The state decides the boundaries of your freedom. So true freedom, of course, is as the saints, mind you, not coming from myself. When the saints speak of freedom, right? And by saints, I mean everyone from the apostles and Christ onto the 20th century and even the 21st century, the recent elders. Whenever they speak about freedom, they firstly speak about freedom from sin. That is true freedom. Freedom from when you obtain theosis, when you are united with Christ, when your conscience is clear, when your soul is enlightened. That is true freedom, not freedom from some earthly, monetary bindings or legal bindings or bindings of authority. Or there's a king over me, there's a mayor over me, there's a boss. I have a nagging wife. All of these freedoms are fleeting and they don't last. The real freedom is the one from sin, essentially. And essentially, it's not just sin, it's freedom from demons. The demons control you, they control your passions, they sort of force themselves down on you, right? They essentially assault you and, uh, yeah, that's the freedom we all seek first, right? We should seek that freedom first. All the other freedoms, of course, will come. God willing, freedom from the New World Order, freedom from certain medical obligations placed upon us, etc., etc. I think all these things need to be considered in the great discussion of state-church relations.
Yeah, I'm pretty much in agreement on that point, right? Ideally, that's what should happen. I think one big mistake people who oppose this do is that they forget that the privileges that we have today is not due to us deciding to be democratic, right? They kind of confuse with, oh, well, ever since the Enlightenment, our lives have been much easier. Well, has it actually? Well, first of all, that's a problem in itself. Even economically speaking, it hasn't been super that much better. Sometimes, yes, there were very big heights, but did the enlightenment happen because of the industrial revolution, or was it the other way around? Well, I mean, sometimes people connect these two events that really might not be as connected as it initially seems. And another point that I want to make is that basically is uh, to kind of continue the point actually about modern society is that the reason why modern society is the way it is isn't because we adopted democracy and then technology came with it. Part of technology does have effects of it. There someone made a good point, for example, about how if you kind of revert back to natural settings, right? Like if you're stranded on an island, 10 people, 5 men, 5 women, notice how everyone reverts to their gender roles. Notice how everyone reverts to kind of like the natural way humans live. They will probably have a leader and he makes the decisions, Men will have their roles, women will have their roles. When you go to nature, that's what happens. And so we kind of really the fact that we are democratic isn't actually a proof of things going well. It's really proves that we've kind of gone away from the natural way things are done. And I'm talking about principles. I'm not saying natural way things are done in the sense that, oh, instead of writing stuff, we're using computers. I'm not talking about it in that sense. I'm talking about natural ways in the sense that what really is consistent with the logi, with the exemplar of man, that is what the blueprint of man itself is, and the purpose of man's existence, which is ultimately Christ himself. We've strayed away from that, right? That's what we've strayed away from. And democracy is something I will argue is kind of an example of that. You look at, for example, isn't it interesting that Greeks had democracy and then they never went back to it when they got an empire? I mean, that's something that really kind of does make you think. Like they never went back to it, right? It didn't even become like a debate. In fact, what happened instead is that they said, well, we can still be democratic in some senses, right? There's elements of, you can say, maybe like minor elements of democracy in certain things, maybe even in church government, right? But that's not due to an ideological reason. That's because, well, in that circumstance, right? Maybe a council of bishops reaching a consensus is just the ideal way to do things instead of having a big mega bishop saying this is what's going to happen, right? Maybe that's just the more Christian thing to do. So it's not. So a lot of people view things from a primarily ideological way, and they make ideologies religions, whereas it's really the other way around. It's a religion that gives meaning to these ideologies or these kind of like systems of governance, and a lot of people really forget about it. So democracy, republics, they really have become religions of their own. And really, again, the basic question you can ask these people: okay, so why should I believe that a republic is the best way of governing things? What's the best way of governing people, right? Where do you derive that from? Is it from vague senses of happiness? Oh, it just makes people happy. Is that your measure? Or are you going to say, well, it's because due to these objective moral realities? But wait a second, you're talking about conceptual, invariant, and most importantly, immaterial ideas, and you're saying they are connected with reality, and you're appealing to these ideas. Where do they come from? Oh, guess what? It has to come from a divine being. That's always 100% the response. That's why these atheists all try to argue for materialism, because the moment they admit that immaterial reality exists, that's the moment religion begins, right? Because that's the domain of religion. But, republics or whatever ideology you believe in, they always have to use religion as an excuse. They always have to appeal to a non-physical entity in order to justify the things that they are doing. And when people don't realize that, and some people realize that, they become New Age or stupid religions or whatever, and some people realize that, and they become, creedal Christians, like Apostolic Christians, like Orthodox Christians, for example. So I think really the way people think is designed by that mode of thinking.
That's right. I think it's also worth considering. David mentioned the mode of thinking. So people essentially they view themselves as happier if they are free from overarching authority, even though that isn't the reality. And most of us do not live a life of, say, freedom from taxation or freedom from some sort of laws. Not all of us are, say, pirates on the high seas, free from obligations of worldly. So essentially, we are lying to ourselves when we say that, oh, we don't want to have a king over us, right? We want to be like, and I hear this from some so-called Orthodox libertarians. They claim that, well, we don't really need a king these days. We don't really need an Orthodox monarch like in the those ancient days, because right now we are free and we're kind of happy. We go to church and we follow. And then you ask them, you guys follow laws, right? And they say yes. And then we ask, well, who instituted those laws? Are these laws, do they have any relation to Christianity? And of course, then the questioning descends down the rabbit hole of, well, I guess who instituted these modern laws and where do they end up, right? very curious. The rabbit hole really does go quite far, and you do end up coming back to the question of, well, do we actually need a Christian? Do we need a revival of some sort of Christian leadership in society, maybe even on a local level? Do we need to participate? Do Orthodox Christians need to sort of vote for Orthodox Christian politicians, even on a local level? Like, does that need to happen? It's like, well, maybe should Orthodox Christians go and become teachers and educators, at least even on a local level? Should we volunteer as, should we open up Orthodox schools for our children? It's like, yes. Should Orthodox Christians become, say, members of parliament? Will that make any changes? That's a different debate. But should we at least participate in these worldly things in order to mold society, at least as far as we can, to some Orthodox ideal, bring it back? Yes, I think that's these are very sort of open. I think these are very open-ended questions, and most of these questions I would answer affirmatively. Yes, I think we should. Um, and of course, I think returning back to the question of, say, saints, right, and like the influence of the church on society, that's one end of the question, right? How does an Orthodox state, for example, influence the church? I think there are two really big examples, David. If you don't mind, I'll bring them up because we actually, at least in the Russian church, these two things come up in liturgy every single Sunday. One, of course, is the hymn we sing during the liturgy, the only begotten Son hymn, only begotten Son and immortal word of God. That short hymn, who instituted that into the liturgy by recommendation? Saint Justinian, a Roman
Exactly.
emperor, right?
Yep.
Exactly. So the Roman emperor himself, at the time, of course, Saint Justinian, he wasn't just given this permission to edit the liturgy at the time because he was emperor. No, he was an emperor plus he was Orthodox. It was a special. He was this privileged person who followed the law of God to the letter. And I mean, we venerate him as a saint to this day. So he was a very holy man. And he essentially said, look, let's add this hymn to the liturgy. And we follow that tradition to this day, 1500 years later. And I'll bring another controversial example, which the Russian church follows. And I suppose the Russian church is quite a large portion of Orthodox Christians. So maybe even the OCA follows this tradition. And I'll explain where it comes from. When we sing the Lord's Prayer during the liturgy. Notice we chant it, we sing it in Russian churches, also in the American churches in the OCA. We never say. Sometimes the creed isn't sung during the liturgy, but the Lord's Prayer is always sung. And where did this tradition begin? Began in the 1500s under the recommendation of the Tsar at the time. His name was Ivan the Fourth. Maybe you may know him as Ivan the Terrible. So him and his, I suppose his great friend Saint Macarius, the Metropolitan at the time, Macarius of Moscow, they essentially decided that yes, it would be better if the Lord's Prayer would be sung at every liturgy. And since then on, even though that was a tradition before, but they made it mainstream and they essentially ordered it. They said from here on in, all Russian liturgies, the Lord's Prayer will be sung only, no more reading it. It will always be sung. And since the 1500s, it has been sung. So notice we have a Tsar, what Tsar essentially means either a king or an emperor in Russian, has cooperated with the bishop in order to change the liturgy and change it in a positive way in order to help Christians, help move things along. Now, this is, of course, you could say, well, what authority does the king have to influence well, no, in the Orthodox Church, the king, being an Orthodox Christian, he goes to confession, he communes, he is also part of the church with us. He participates in the life of the church. Yes, we do give kings these certain privileges, and yes, these are moments when the state has essentially entered into this symbiosis with, clergymen, and they've created this greatly positive change. I think these are two good examples. Saint Justinian with the, of course, only begotten Son hymn, and Ivan the Terrible alongside Saint Macarius. They changed the Lord's Prayer so that it could be sung every liturgy. I think these are two examples which we frankly follow in the Russian Church every Sunday. Sorry, David.
Yeah, I know about the singing the Ocha Nash. I also
Yep.
know that well, we also kind of had to understand, like, oh, I thought your liturgy never changes, but here going from normally saying the prayer to the same prayer being sung is not really a radical change, right? And it's
No.
something, and these rules, these things are made for the benefit of us so that we can pray to God as to the best of our abilities, right? And so what was, for example, the rationale behind singing the Our Father, for example? Do you know about the reason that was used
Well,
to like make that change?
the reason primarily was because at that time the Russian liturgy was quite long. Remember, at the time, this was before the schism, so the Russian liturgy was sometimes it went for 4 hours long, which was very different from, say, in the Greek tradition when the chanting is a little bit. So that wasn't the only hymn which they began singing. It was there was a few hymns which they changed at the same time in order to speed the liturgy up. Unfortunately, in Church Slavonic liturgy, in the way they sung it back then was quite long. It went on for standard about 4 hours long, which was different. The Greek liturgy went on for about 1.5 to 2 hours, right? In the Russian church, it was until they changed some of this. It was essentially the singing style. If you go to a Russian church today, you'll notice the hymns are sung quite fancifully, and they're sung in a very sort of a little bit faster and a bit with a bit more haste than, say, those at Greek churches. And this essentially began with these reforms of Saint Macarius essentially deciding, look, a lot of people are actually, they're attending church, but they're actually falling asleep, and a lot of people would. And there were church rules. There were rules going back to the apostles, essentially saying that, look, when the gospel is being read, we have to stand to attention. Essentially, people would essentially leave the church before the gospel reading, so people would get bored. The liturgy just went on for too long. And this is of course due to our human weakness. We can't stand these 4 hour long services just every Sunday. So essentially when the church instituted these reforms to the singing styles, this was one of them, and we follow it to this day. But yeah, it was under the influence of, you can say, the state, or the personification of the state in the figure of the Tsar. So, at the time, Tsar Ivan IV. He made that recommendation himself because he said, "Look, the church attendance is falling. We're going to have to streamline the liturgy a bit more. At least not cut out any prayers, but make some of them a little bit faster." Hence the change.
Yeah, that obviously. So you can see then that like these non-essential changes in the liturgy is really done to actually worship the liturgy properly, instead of uh, instead of like, oh, you only do 4 hours, we do
Being
6 hours,
Pharisees, yep.
bro. Like, you can't have that kind of logic. And uh it also kind of again reminds me of the difference between like forcing these things and having them do naturally. Is again, you know if you're spiritually strong, you can obviously withstand 4 hours of liturgy. But for a lot of laymen, that's a very difficult task for them to achieve. They just can't do it, right? Um, I'll be honest. It will be very difficult for me to go to liturgy if it was 4 hours instead of 2 hours, right? Every week, every Sunday, like one 5 hour liturgy, which is, I went to the Pentecost liturgy 2 years ago in the
Yep.
EP church. It was like 5 hours. Like, you can last like one instance of 5 hours. Imagine doing that every single week. That's very difficult, and that's not
Yep.
really how the Greek liturgy was done either. So it's so yeah, and as you said, as a layman now, laity aren't just people that are just outside the church, right? So in the vestibule, you kind of have this idea of, well, laymen are the spectators, and the clergy are like the real players. That's not
That's
really how the church government works, right? Laity are part of the church. That's why the emperor is a layman, but he's the highest kind of a layman. You see, monastics are laity, but most people don't really see them as laymen, right? They're part of the church, and many monks that were not priests, right? Like a monk that is a priest is clergy, right? He's not layman, but not all monks are hieromonks, right? The point that I'm trying to make is that many people were monks, but they were just laity that wrote treatises, or perhaps they were just elders that people followed and were inspired by, and they were very influential, right? And so. So this kind of also makes you understand that the emperor as a layman just is a highest rank of that laity, right? So he doesn't constitute an essential aspect of the church government. You see, so that's why the church can stay alive and withstand without an emperor, right? But it sure does help having an emperor, right?
Oh,
In
and
instances.
And I see a lot of people, essentially when the subject of state and church relations comes up a lot on Twitter, for example, or in Discord or on YouTube, there's always this poisoning of the well that occurs when you mention, well, look, at one point we had these tsars, these emperors, these Christian princes who helped bishops out, and then you have somebody jump in and say, well, but we don't need that anymore. It's like, who are you to say that, sir? It's like, that's something, for example, the monks didn't exist in the church as an institution. Tonsure, monks weren't tonsured back in the day, right? Prior to the 300s AD. And would you say, well, we don't need monks anymore because I guess life in the world, life in the cities is hard enough, right? Why do you need to go to a monastery in 2022, right? It's this idea that we have to reduce everything to the absolute minimum. I think it's a little bit excessive because technically speaking, in the church, patriarchs and metropolitans are also later developments. So we have patriarchs really didn't exist. We had bishops, we had archbishops so bishops of large cities were given the title of archbishop. And in the future, of course, cities grew, these Christian cities grew, and metropolises were led, the laity of them, the Orthodox community of a metropolis would be led by a metropolitan. And later you had entire regions, almost, you can say countries, parts of the empire were led by patriarchs, right? This title of patriarch, where is it taken from? The Old Testament, right? Essentially, the Christian church brought back this ancient grace-filled title from the times of Noah back, it's still, of course, a patriarch is only a bishop, but he has extra administrative duties. And if you want to be like us, I suppose some people, they want to be these hardcore reductionists. They say, well, we don't really need patriarchs. You're completely right. The church can absolutely survive with no patriarchs whatsoever. You can even say the church could survive with no monks, could survive with no emperors, kings, but God provides them to us. And who are we to decline, right, when they are provided to us? That we have a patriarch in Russia now. We're not going to say, well, let's get rid of the patriarch. We don't need him. We can just have a local bishop and that's it, just like the early Christians. No, that is, in a way, it's a form of spiritual delusion to kind of, put ourselves I guess, in God's place and say, well, we can, it can just be me, David, and two bishops, and that's the entire church, just the four of us, and we can have liturgies and have communion and confession and we'll be fine. And we don't need anybody else. We don't even need this church jurisdiction system, which occurred, the church jurisdictions didn't even exist back in the day. I couldn't say that. I mean, we can reduce it. So people, when church-state relations essentially are brought up, a lot of people poison the well by saying, well, these things are not essential. Of course, we understand the things that are essential in the church there aren't that many things that are essential, right? You don't even need to serve a full liturgy. You can have a shortened version of the liturgy if you want. People serve liturgies in prison. People serve liturgies without candles or vestments or icons, right? You can serve a liturgy with the bare minimum things, and you can, there's of course a certain limit you can reach, but I will say that much. I'm not sure if you agree with me, David, but I think that's also worth mentioning, especially in online discourse when it gets really toxic when they say, well, this church-state relation is a bit too fussy. It's a bit too detailed for me. It's like, well, it is part of our tradition still, right? We had these saints, right? Who are we to contradict them and to countersignal them, right?
Yeah, and it's not just an individual saint. It's a great number of them. When I say,
all of them.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, essentially, even the saints who criticized particular emperors, for example, Saint Photius had in the 800s, he had a very big gripe with, he made sure the emperor listened to him to the letter. He was essentially the alpha of the symphony relationship. He made sure Emperor Basil I listened to him exactly because he was done. He was like, okay, we're not going back to iconoclasm. We're going to listen to me. And he kind of dominated the conversation. And then, of course, we see the opposite in during the Russian period. The Tsars, for a large portion, especially after Patriarch Nikon, the Tsars dominated the conversation for a long time. And Nicholas II, if you remember, he had a huge sway over the church. He essentially wanted to canonize certain saints like Seraphim of Sarov, the famous Russian saint of whom you're probably familiar with him, the great miracle worker. The Russian bishops didn't want to canonize Seraphim of Sarov. Why? And you know what their justification was for not canonizing him? Well, his relics weren't as incorrupt. They didn't reach a certain threshold of incorruptness. I kid you not. That was their analysis. And St. Nicholas, the emperor at the time, he was just like, okay, no, we're canonizing him now. Like, we'll just do it. And they did it, and look, to this day, miracles are performed by him, this great saint, right? He was venerated for 100 years prior to that. The Russian bishops were hesitant. So the emperor gave him a little bit of a nudge, a recommendation. They did it, you know. These things, these organic relations, and of course, notice all these relations are always personal. It's always person to person. It's not the emperor, the tsar, the prince is an actual human person who goes to confession and has communion. It's not an institution. It's not a government body. It's not a parliament forcing itself on a church. That's the difference between, say, a parliament talking to a patriarch or a parliament speaking to a synod. It's not. It's like these two sort of impersonal bodies, and of course, as David, of course, him being an expert on Christology and Triadology and whatnot, he understands Christianity. Of course, in a large part, its theology begins with personhood, the personhood, of course, of Christ. So, of course, in state-church relations, personhood matters a lot. The personal, the personhood of the patriarch, the bishop, and the ruler it's himself or herself.
Yeah, I think this covers a lot of what we want to talk about. Maybe we can go on about talk about Russia exclusively or anything like that in a different stream. But do you have anything else to add, or you want to kind of cut things off? Because I think
we've covered like a
hours,
large. Yeah, we've covered quite a large portion of, I suppose, the subjects that come up these days in relation to church and state. I think you've been quite thorough, and there's a lot. There's a lot to take in, I think, for any listener. And of course, people feel free to do your own research and comment in the comment section with any objections you have or anything you found quite interesting or anything you'd like sources about. Of course, me and David are willing to provide any sort of explanations.
I usually don't check YouTube comments as a principle. But if you wanna be in the comments, George, you can go ahead.
Of course.
I usually stay away from that kind of stuff because usually it's a source of pride at best and a source of anger at worst. So I just keep it out of my life
That's why.
Because like for example, it's better and more efficient for me to do videos, so it reaches a lot more larger audience than just like getting into a dispute with someone in the comment section. I always was kind of like against that kind of thing for my personal life. But before I finish, I want to thank David Schutt for the $5 super chat again. He said, "An easy life isn't necessarily a good life. An easy life doesn't help us in our salvation." It's pretty true. So decadence is something that we should be avoiding. And having said that, I also want to thank you, George, for being here in my stream and blessing my stream. I want to also thank my Patreon financiers: Marco, Diet Solite, Allison, Eddie, Far, Justin, Node, Maximus, Mitch, Jonathan, Steven, Vlad, Carrie, Ignatius, Mike, Jack, Nectarius, Flood Basement, Dave, Seraphim, and Norbert. Thank you all for supporting my channel on Patreon. If you want some Patreon benefits, you can check my Patreon page as well. But again, thank you all for watching and liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Any last words you have before I send you to the gallows?
Well, I say God bless everyone, and of course, attend the liturgy, read Holy Scripture, read the Orthodox Study Bible. Stay on top of things, keep an open mind, and feel free to follow me on Twitter if you'd like. It's in the description. Of course, follow David and stay tuned. He will have some more content coming up for you guys, definitely. So definitely good stuff in the works.
All right. Thank you for that. And I'll see all of you in the next video or stream.